If you pursue a spiritual lifestyle, you'll undoubtedly come across this idea of oneness, that everything is ultimately connected, inseparable, unified. Of course, in our ordinary waking consciousness, this makes little sense. It flies in the face of our common everyday experience, where we are clearly separate from the objects in our environment, from tables and chairs, from plants and animals, from each other. We have these distinct bodies, which constitute the boundaries of our individuality. They delineate the internal I from the external other. This is certainly true from a physical perspective in a three-dimensional reality. But underlying that, or enveloping it if you prefer, is where this elusive oneness exists. Truthfully, I could never really understand what all the spiritual gurus were talking about when they claimed that everything is one, because as mentioned above, it utterly defied my personal life experience and what my physical senses and rational mind were feeding me. Everything that school and mainstream science were teaching. It just didn't seem to make sense. And so I tended to skim over these parts of the book or lecture with a somewhat dismissive attitude. Like, yeah, buddy, sure, that makes sense on a theoretical level, I guess. Intellectually, I could sort of see it. It seemed like a nice concept, but was just so far removed from my own experience. It wasn't until I began experimenting with psychedelics that I would finally get a taste of what it actually felt like. To give an example, during one of my earlier shroom trips, while lying in bed, I began to dissociate from my physical form. It was sort of like when you get a local anesthetic and everything goes numb, except that feeling was basically applied over my entire body. I just felt like an amorphous blob, a consciousness that was just sort of floating there. I could still move if I wanted to, although getting up to go to the bathroom proved to be an epic struggle. But there was no real desire to move, or do anything for that matter. And in this unusual state, I felt at one with the bed, like it was a part of me. Sure, it could still be identified independently, in the same way that your hand can be isolated and identified independently, but it felt fundamentally connected to me. Granted, I couldn't move or control the bed like I could my hand, but so what? There are many parts of your body that you can't consciously manipulate. Your hair, nails, teeth, all your internal organs, but they are obviously a part of you nonetheless. So here, in this instance, oneness manifested as the dissolving of boundaries that ordinarily separate self from other. Although this was admittedly only a feeling of being at one with the bed, I didn't feel the same connection to the walls or ceiling or anything else in my bedroom, but it was at least a dissolving of the normal ego perspective. It was the beginning of oneness, like dipping one's foot into the water of source, but not really diving in. In another, more recent trip, however, I had a more expansive experience. Here I had combined modest amounts of psilocybin and LSD, and the sense of oneness manifested rather differently. It was more of a deep meditative state, less body-centric and more mind or heart-centered, if that makes sense. It was the bliss of being present in the moment, in the now, as masters like Eckhart Tolle or Ram Dass might say. This is what I wrote in my trip report as I was coming down that evening. You can feel the bliss of that moment, for all we ever have is the now. That is the eternity of God. It is the timeless oneness that connects us all, every person who has ever lived, all our past lives, every conscious being. It is the same one consciousness. And you can feel it through the tranquility of the meditative state of being. We cannot, however, comprehend it or logically explain it, for it is too powerful for us to wrap our tiny 3D monkey brains around. It is utterly beyond our comprehension. But we can definitely feel it, sense it, and experience it. That state is quiet inner peace, a relaxed, loving awareness. It is like a warm sun that is always shining, or a still body of water. That is God. Indeed, even at the very beginning of this trip, as I was sitting cross legged on my meditation cushion and the effects were just starting to kick in, I had this distinct impression of feeling this same oneness before, in past lives perhaps. Now, I'm not psychically inclined by any means. I am an amateur when it comes to meditative practices and have never exhibited psychic abilities or recalled past lives or anything like that, but this insight felt quite solid. And it would make sense, rationally speaking, that if this oneness, this source, really is timeless and eternal and consistently uniform, that it would be perceived more or less the same by anyone, at any point throughout history. As I wrote above, it is like light, like a warm, soft-glowing sun. And even in the physical world, the sun has surely not changed in any perceptible way over thousands of years. This means that our ancestors would have perceived it the same as us. And the sun is merely a physical approximation of this source, a mortal version in the sense that it will one day burn out or explode. So if the sun has that sort of longevity and persistence within a physical universe that is constantly changing, why wouldn't we expect the one source, which is not bound by our three-dimensional laws of physics, to be eternal and immutable? Anyway, to get back on track here and wrap things up, these were two direct glimpses I had of oneness, explained to the best of my abilities. Keep in mind that while I had these experiences under the effects of potent conscious-altering substances, it can surely also be perceived while sober, through deeply focused meditation, for example, or perhaps in other ways as well. If you can think of another avenue or provide your own example, please share it with us in the comments. Hope you found this interesting, and thank you for watching.